So, great Father Greg Boyle.
Thank you very much. I want to thank my brother Jesuits, Jim and John, and the Kennedy family, and all the nice people we dined with, organizing committee last night. It's a privilege to be with you. It's the privilege of my life, to have worked with gang members for 30 years and to have come to know them. They've entered my life, they've altered my heart, they've reshaped how I think things, they've helped me move beyond the mind I have. The day won't ever come when I am more noble, or I have more courage, or I'm closer to God than these thousands of men and women. People like Luis Perez, who kind of runs the place at Homeboy along with some other homies. He's a homeboy, been to prison, tattooed, a felon, heroin addict, and now he's personnel director. And he's pretty good at speaking. I've heard him give many talks. He tells his story. And so we went out to dinner, and he was giving me tips on how to speak publicly. He said, you have to pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. I said, yeah, no shit. So that's some good advice there. So what brings you out here on a Saturday morning? I don't think it's actually me. I think it's a longing to somehow imitate the kind of God we believe in. We want to heed the call of Pope Francis to go to the margins, because we know that if we go out there, we look under our feet, the margins get erased because we chose to do that. And so we imagine a circle of compassion, and then we imagine nobody standing outside that circle. And to that end, we seek in our way, in our own particularity, to dismantle the barriers that exclude. This is what we're all called to do. That's not some special rarefied call. It's what we're all meant to do in our way. So we stand out at the margins with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. We choose to stand with those whose dignity has been denied and those whose burdens are more than they can bear. Every once in a while, how privileged we feel when we're invited to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out, with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And we stand out there, and with our lives we promote and nurture and announce God's dream come true, a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. And we do this against all odds. We stand at the margins and we brace ourselves because people will accuse us of wasting our time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "In this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." And we stand at the margins because with God and Jesus and the whole church, we want to make those voices heard. None of this makes any sense unless we kind of anchor ourselves in the ground of our own being, that somehow we're always going to represent the God we believe in. I had a spiritual director, a Jesuit, years ago, who used to always say to me, "We need a better God than the one we have." And which is true, because we're human beings, we can't help ourselves, but we can catch ourselves. We're endlessly creating God in our own image. And this happens when we don't graduate from our kind of third grade sense of who God is. And how do we move into what St. Ignatius calls the God who's always greater, the spacious, expansive God, the God who loves us without measure and without regret, the God who's too busy loving us to have any time left for anything else, the God that Jesus knew in his own mystical union with this tender, intimate, close God. And so we want to move to that place because we were endlessly creating God in our own image. Anne Lamott always says that you've created God in your own image if God hates all the same people you do, So, watch for that because then if we're puny and tiny and judgmental and exacting and demanding, how is your God not going to be that way? This is how the homies have altered my heart and my conception of God. Usually they do it in kind of this charming roundabout way. They kind of out-yogi Yogi Berra. They mangle the English language in a way that I find charming and always illuminating. Like a homegirl named Lisa, one of our trainees, one of our hundreds and hundreds of trainees we have at Homeboy, a homegirl, and she comes in at the end of the day, she wants to introduce her man to me. And she, standing in my office, and she says, "This is my sufficient other." And I said, "No doubt." I've been around for 30 years working in this organization, and it's now a $19 million annual operation, and I'm happy to announce that I have a CEO, Tom Voso, who's a wonderful man who kind of runs the day-to-day and worries about cash flow and budgets and allows me to be here on this Saturday morning. And so he kind of runs the thing, and so I had a homie in my office not long ago, and he said, "Damn, G, my lady, she's in a bad mood today." I said, "Why?" "Well, she's beginning her administration period." And I said, "Well, I'm just ending mine, so kind of know what she's going through." But my favorite one happened when I was, my parish at the moment is all the detention facilities in LA County. We've got a lot of them. And so I was at a juvenile hall in San Fernando, and I'm actually going there tomorrow. And, there's a big gym and about 300 minors, mainly males, but almost all gang members. And, as you preside, I was vested with the Albin stole, and I was sitting on a folding chair up at the altar. And they have these little sheets they hand out that have the English and the Spanish, the readings. And sometimes as a presider, you want to close your eyes and hear and receive the word proclaimed. So a homie, a gang member, got up and he was reading the psalm with kind of an overabundance of confidence, and he said, "The Lord is exhausted." And I said, "What the hell?" And I looked at the sheet, and it was, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. Because if you think about it, I'm not so sure I want to spend eternity with a God who really is that needy of being exalted, frankly. I like the notion of exhausted. You've all had that experience, where you say, "I'm exhausted," but it's a good tired because I spent the weekend helping a friend move into an apartment, or I had the grandkids the whole weekend with us. It's a good tired. That God sort of knows this good tired extension of God's self in our general direction, too busy loving us to be disappointed or let down. But we have this notion that somehow we have to measure up and that we're eternally disappointing, and somehow we got to get beyond that. Otherwise, we're going to be unable to stand at the margins in the way that God hopes we will. I think it's essential. I don't know why this message doesn't get through. You know, in the gospel, all you really hear from on high, the voice from above, is always a voice of blessing. It's a never voice of disappointment or shaking God's head or wagging God's finger. It's always, you are my beloved, in whom I'm wonderfully pleased. That's the message. But we go, I'm sorry, how did I let you down? How am I a disappointment to you? Could you point out the ways that I haven't measured up? And God doesn't know what we're talking about. In fact, we least resemble God when we're disappointed in each other, frankly. But I don't know why that message doesn't come through. It's a little bit like this crazy autocorrect thing. Am I alone? Am I alone in hating it? Just yesterday, a homie who I don't know, but a gang member had given him my cell phone number, so he was a little more formal with me, and he was introducing himself, and at the beginning he tries to type Father Greg, but autocorrect helped him and put Fat Boy Greg. At least I think he was making a mistake there. Not entirely sure. Once a homegirl named Bertha, she texted me on a Sunday and she said, "Where are you at?" And I texted to her, I said, "I'm about to speak to a room full of monjas," and monjas is Spanish for sisters, nuns, religious women. "I'm about to speak to a room full of monjas." I pushed send and autocorrect told her that I was about to speak to a room full of ninjas. Which, she thought was pretty darn interesting. My worst one, the homies are always, I get 1,000 text messages a day, and it's like, their hair is always on fire, and oh my gosh, and how am I going to pay my rent? I just need this much. They're going to cut off my lights, that kind of thing. And well, this one, I just didn't have any money, and I just had to admit it. So I wrote this homie, I said only this: "Things are tight." I pushed send, autocorrect told him, "Thongs are tight." And he wrote back, "Sorry to hear that." What about my rent? I don't know why we have such a hard time with this message, because it's so hard for us to let go of this notion we have of the God who's just close and intimate, who's not exalted, but is exhausted in this amazing kind of love, the likes of which we just can barely understand. And we want to be a mystic like Jesus was, because he operated out of that sense, And yet we can't let go of this third grade notion we have. Even Jesus, if we look at Jesus, he knew the Hebrew Bible really well, but he only quotes it twice. He quotes Leviticus, and he knows all the 28 thou shalt nots, but he doesn't quote even one of those. He only says, love your neighbor as yourself, because he kind of knows what kind of God we have. The longest passage he quotes is from Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and good news and liberty to captives and freedom for the prisoner, and the year of favor. That's where he ends, period. But there is no period in Isaiah 61, because it talks about the year of favor and the age of and the vengeance of our God. It talks about vengeance. And Jesus just excludes it. It's in the Bible. He just omits it. Why would he leave it out? Well, because he doesn't believe it. He just doesn't believe it. That's why he leaves it out. He's selective. He edits. Only because he knows what kind of God we have, not because he's capricious. He just says, yeah, no, that's not the God we have. It's like Desmond Tutu says, I refuse to go to a homophobic heaven. That's right. Only because he knows what kind of God we have. Even, hell, saints will kind of say, they get to a certain point of union with this God who loves them without measure and without regret. And they go, yeah, I believe in hell, but I think it's empty. It's because they kind of know what God we have. The New Yorker magazine, there was a theologian who was talking about hell, and he was pounding the table, and he said, there has to be a hell. Because if you reject God, God has to reject you. And I remember putting the magazine down, and I conjured up the image of 5 holy people I know, and then I tried to imagine me rejecting them. I hate you, I'll never talk to you again, we're done. And then I tried to imagine them rejecting me. And that's impossible. Of course they wouldn't. They'd love me no matter what. Because they're holy and because they know the kind of God we have. And is this a theologian suggesting that God is not as holy as the holiest people we know? Preposterous. This is why it's absolutely essential to somehow find the God who is dear and wants to be united to us, who's intimate and close, and who in fact doesn't want anything from us, only wants for us, like the best inclination as a parent with a child. I only want for you that your joy, my joy may be yours, and your joy complete. I was giving a talk once at a very shishi-foo-foo private school, and it was at night, and it was just faculty and parents, and it was a packed auditorium. But there were no students, and it was a K-12, very elite school. But in the front row, I found out there was a kid, I later found out his name was Diego, and he was 10 years old, and he goes to school there. And his parents were kind of the organizers of the event, so he was the only student there. But he was in the front row, and I watched him, you know, anything that I said that was remotely funny, he would guffaw and slap his knee. He really got it. And I remember thinking, how does this kid get this, you know? And then anything a story I told that was a little bit remotely slack jaw producing, he'd get slack jawed on me, you know? And I would kind of stand outside myself and say, wow, how is this kid getting all this? And then I would end with this story that I often used to, that's in the book Tattoos, and it's a story of Puppet and Youngster, where Puppet gets beaten to death, and Puppet and Youngster are enemies, and it ends with Youngster saying, he wasn't my enemy, he was my friend, we worked together. And I look at the adults, and the adults are discreetly flicking tears, but not Diego. He's just full-blown sobbing, howling. He can't be consoled. He's crying so loudly. And again, I put my talk on autopilot, and I'm watching him, and I think, wow, this kid's amazing that he gets this so deeply. Well, his mom is sitting next to him, and she's got this smile on her face, and she very gently reaches her arm, and when her hand touches his shoulder, what he does next is a showstopper. He turns to his mom and he says, "What?" Now, anyone who's ever raised an adolescent or known one or been one knows exactly what that is. And everybody shuts up. I shut up because it really stopped the show. And then he demurs a little, but he's not that regretful. And he turns to his mom, but kind of in a stage whisper, "What?" And I knew exactly what he was saying, as all of you do. He's saying, how have I let you down? How have I disappointed you? How am I embarrassing you? What is it that you would have me do? The list is long. But I looked at the face of this mother, and she wasn't trying to curtail his emotion. She was trying to communicate 2 things. How did I get so lucky to have a son like you? And what breaks your heart breaks mine too. That's it. And that is exactly how God sees us. In fact, she didn't want anything from him when she put her hand on his shoulder. She only wanted for him. So I told that story last summer at the Chautauqua Institute, and afterwards a Methodist minister came up to me and he said, "I loved your talk, but I disagreed with that one thing." I said, "What one thing?" "The thing that God doesn't want from us, he just wants for us." And he said, "What about the 10 Commandments?" And I said, "What about them?" Because if you know the God you have like Jesus knew, the God who only wants for us, who needs to tell you not to steal? Who needs to tell you not to lie? Who needs to tell you not to covet your neighbor's cow or whatever the heck, Because that's the difference between a faith that's from the inside out and one that's from the outside in. We want to be mystics like Jesus, who knows deeply what kind of love we're called to be. We're not being asked for our allegiance to anything. We're being asked to adhere to a loving way of life. Otherwise, we will not be able to withstand the experience of standing at the margins. And we stand there you don't go to the margins to rescue anybody or to save anybody or to even make a difference. You go there because our whole life depends on it. This is how God has sort of set this up. It's a little bit like the very provocatively titled book by John Sobrino, a Jesuit theologian, entitled "No Salvation Outside the Poor." It's kind of the same concept. So the original covenantal relationship says from God, "As I have loved you," now we fully expect him to say, "Please love me back," but he doesn't. He says, "As I have loved you, so must you have a special, careful, preferential love for the widow and the orphan and the stranger." And God says this because he thinks these three subgroupings of the poor know what it's like to have been cut off. And because they know what this particular kind of suffering is, God thinks they're trustworthy to lead the rest of us to the kinship of God. That's my experience. I finished an interview with somebody from PBS, and they ended the interview with this question: "How does it feel to have saved thousands and thousands of lives?" And I said, "Honest to God, I'm not trying to be coy or cute. I don't know what you're talking about. I know that I show up every day and my life is absolutely altered, that the homies rescue me every day from my cowardice and from my judgment. They rescue me and they return me to myself. And I'm deeply, profoundly grateful to them for the ways that they have saved me." But that's the truth. At Homeboy Industries, I'm not the great healer, and that gang member over there is in need of my exquisite healing. The truth be told, we're all a cry for help. We're all in need of healing. It's one of the things that joins us together as members of the human family. So, we're inclined to serve, and that's a good thing, but that's where you begin. That can't be where we end. Service is the hallway that gets you to the ballroom. You want to get to the ballroom, which is the place of union, kinship, exquisite mutuality, where there is no us and them, there's just us. Where it isn't about service provider, service recipient. No, we don't want that, because that creates a distance still. There's distance in service. You want to get through this hallway to the place where God's dream can come true, this community of kinship, such that God might recognize it. One of the great privileges of my life was knowing Cesar Chavez as a friend, and he was the best listener I've ever been in the presence of. If you were having a conversation with him, nobody else existed, only you. He was never looking over your shoulder to see if someone more important was on the approach. But once famously, a reporter had commented to him and said, "Wow, these farm workers, they sure love you." And Cesar just smiled and shrugged and said, "The feeling's mutual," which of course is the hope. We want to reclaim that. We want to get to this place where there is no daylight that ever separates us, even in our service, even as we stand at the margins. I remember no homie found more job opportunities through our organization than a kid everybody called Dreamer. I knew him since he was a little mocosito growing up in the housing projects. Got into a gang at 13, and he's about 40 now, I guess, but in his early 20s, he was kind of a yo-yo, in and out of being locked up. And he'd come into my office, I'd find him a job in the private sector, or I'd find some job in one of our social enterprises at Homeboy Industries. Very smart kid with a dangerous sense of humor, which I always appreciated. And but this one time he had finished, he was a kind of a yo-yo back and forth, and this happened quite a bit. And he'd be working for a time, and then he'd gravitate back to vague criminality, usually something involving drugs, the sale of or the use of, and then he'd wander back to me. And so this one time he had finished a 4-month stretch at county jail, a probation violation, and there he is sitting in front of my desk. And he says what gang members often say, "This time it'll be different." I go, all right. So with him sitting there, I called a friend of mine who owned a vending machine company, a man named Gary, who had hired homies in the past, and I was hoping against hope maybe he'll do it again. And sure enough, he says, "Yeah, tell him he can start tomorrow." That's a holy man right there. So Dreamer began work the very next day at the vending machine company. Well, 2 weeks later, there he is again, sitting in front of my desk. And I look at him and I said, "Híjole, Madre Santa, I can't even believe this is happening. Here you are again." But this time he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out an envelope, his very first paycheck, and he says, "Damn, G, this paycheck makes me feel proper." I mean, my mom, she's proud of me, and my kids, they're not ashamed of me. And you know who I have to thank for this job. And I said, "Well, who?" And he looked at me strangely and he said, "Well, God, of course." "Oh, no, that's right. That would be God." Yeah. He said, "You thought I was going to say you." I said, "No, gosh. No, God's number one." And he said, "You are so lucky we're not living in them Genesis days." "I'm sorry, them Genesis days?" He goes, "Yeah, because God would have had struck down your ass already by now." Well, I guess he told me, but all I remember is we fell out of our chairs. We died laughing. And I defy you to identify exactly who's the service provider, who's the service recipient. It's mutual. We want to reimagine our church so that it lives from that place of mystical union with God, the encounter that Jesus had with God. And then we want to take seriously what Jesus took seriously. And he seemed to only take 4 things seriously. They're big things: inclusion, nonviolence, compassionate loving kindness, and acceptance. That's what we want. Oddly, Whoopi Goldberg was interviewed in a magazine, a Q&A, and they asked her, "What living person do you most admire?" And she said, "Pope Francis." And then she adds this, "Yeah, he's going with the original program." Yeah, that's what we want. We want to go with the original program. inclusion, nonviolence, compassionate, loving kindness, acceptance. We want to be in the world who God is. So Homeboy was born a long time ago in 1988 when I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city of Los Angeles, nestled in the middle of two public housing projects, Pico Gardens, Aliso Village, the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war with each other, which was unheard of, making it, according to the LAPD, the place of the highest concentration of gang activity anywhere in the world was my parish. I didn't know that. So I buried my first young person when, in 1988, a kid killed because of this sadness. I will bury my 219th when I go home, a young man named Mark, who texted me every day, "Good morning, Pops," every single day, up till Saturday. And then I didn't hear from him. And then on Monday, one of the homegirls there said, "Did you hear Mark was killed on Saturday?" So, anyway, in the early days, we did a lot of things. We started a school because there were so many junior high, middle school age gang members who had been given the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them, so we started a school because they were wreaking havoc, writing on the walls and violent. I'd go out to them and I'd say, "If I found a school that would take you, would you go?" And they all said yes. And then I couldn't find a school that would take them. So right across the street from the church was our elementary school, grades K to 8, first 2 floors. But the entire 3rd floor was the convent where the ninjas lived. So I gathered them all together in the living room and I sat them down and I said, "Look, would you guys mind moving out and we could turn the convent into a school for gang members?" And they said, "Sure." So I'm making this long story short. So that brought gang members to the church, which kind of upset the apple cart, Parishioners started to say, "Shouldn't churches be hermetically sealed? Good people in, bad people out." But it's funny, as I look back, we were all just trying to return to the original program. And then gang members said if only we had jobs, and so myself and the women in the parish, we marched around the factories trying to get them that surrounded the projects, hoping to find felony-friendly employers, and I wasn't so forthcoming. So we started a lot of crews, 60 enemy rival gang members, maintenance crew, landscaping crew, a crew to build our child care center. Then 1992 came and the unrest after the Rodney King verdict, and every part of the city exploded except the poorest community in the city. And the LA Times wanted to know why, and I said, well, I think it's because we had 60 strategically hired gang members who wanted to have a reason to get up in the morning and a reason not to torch their community at night. A movie producer read this, summoned me, offered me money, and he said, "What should I do with my money?" And I said, "Why don't you buy this bakery across the street from the church. It has ovens. It's an abandoned place. We could put hairnets on gang members. We could bake bread. We'll call it Homeboy Bakery." That was the whole extent of my business plan. And he said sure, and so we were off and running, and a month later we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market. Once we had plural, we changed our name from Jobs for a Future to Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved. And not every thing worked. I'll be the first to admit it. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. Who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. I did not see that coming. And you never intend to do anything like this, but honest to God, we just evolved, backed our way into becoming the largest gang intervention rehab reentry program on the planet. 15,000 folks a year walk through our doors. Most of them want to be part of our 18-month training program, after which we help them find jobs in the private sector. Tattoo removal, therapy, case management. We have 8 social enterprises where, rivals work side by side with each other. It's a community of tenderness. It's God's dream come true. That you may be one, Jesus tells us, is God's dream come true. All of us are called to be enlightened witnesses, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love return people to themselves. We're kind of allergic to holding the bar up and asking homies to measure up. We'd prefer to just hold the mirror up and tell people the truth, knowing that my truth is your truth and your truth is a gang member's truth, and it's all the same truth. And here's the truth. You are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. And what folks on the margins know that's the truth, they become that truth, but that's the same for all of us. We inhabit that truth once you know it. No bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. Death can't touch it because it's huge. You want folks on the margins to be able to look in the mirror and say, it is the privilege of my lifetime to be who I am, because that's how God sees. But as Marcus Borg says, the principal suffering of the poor throughout history and throughout Scripture is shame and disgrace. So you have to reach in. You have to dismantle messages of shame and disgrace that keep people from seeing their truth. You read the Acts of the Apostles, it'll tell you kind of how to measure the health of a community, see how they love one another. There's nobody needy in this community. My favorite one is an odd one. It says simply, and awe came upon everyone. It would seem that the measure of health of any community at all, including this one, may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. To kind of live in that kind of health is also the original program. I remember some years ago I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia, and I always say yes, which is a problem, and then but I didn't really read the not so fine print in the letter until way later, and it was a gang in-service from 9 to 5. I figure maybe I'll open it, or maybe I'm keynote at the lunch, maybe I close it, something like that. So I look it up and, okay, I am to be the only speaker at this conference from 9 to 5. So quickly I bring into my office 2 homies, Andre and Jose, and I sit them down and I said, look, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up and tell your stories. Take your time. Because we got a long-ass day to fill. Well, I'd never heard their stories, and Jose gets up, and he was about 25 at the time, gang member, tattooed, felon, been to prison, parolee. But he'd worked his way through our 18-month program and landed for a time as a very valued member of our substance abuse team, a man solid in his own recovery. And now he was helping younger homies with their addiction issues, and been to prison and everything, but he also had a long stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. But he gets up in front of these 600 social workers and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when my mom looked at me and said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers audibly gasp. And then he says, it sounds way worse in Spanish. And we got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. He said, I think I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage. She knocks on the door, and the guy comes to the door, and she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school every day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through, and second t-shirt because you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt. You couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? Then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. When he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For we are all a cry for help. And if we don't welcome our own wounds, we will be tempted to despise the wounded. And that is part, for sure, of the original program. Let me finish this section of our time together with a story and then think of your questions. It occurs to universities often enough to force their students to read my book against their will. I'm not complaining. So my alma mater in Spokane, Washington, Gonzaga, undefeated, only team undefeated, and so they invited me to speak to their freshmen who they had forced to read my book, and they said, bring 2 homies with you, and I do if they pay, for them to go, and so I picked 2 homies, Bobby, African-American who worked in the bakery at the time, and Mario, who worked in our merchandise store where we sell our logo stuff. And I always pick homies the same way. I always pick enemies, rivals, just so that they will share a hotel room just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who have never flown before, just for the thrill of seeing gang members panicked in the sky. So I've done this hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, but I've never picked anybody more terrified of flying, honest to God, than this kid Mario. I mean, he was so frightened, and I'd never seen this. He was actually hyperventilating, and we hadn't even gotten on the plane yet. So we were flying out of Burbank Airport. If you've ever flown, it's this kind of a small airport, big bay windows, Southwest Airlines mainly. And they don't have that hermetically sealed chute that you get on and to board. You have to walk out onto the tarmac. And so Southwest is featured in having 2 ways to get up: stairs at the front of the plane and stairs at the back of the plane. And I'm sitting with Mario, he's next to me, and it's early morning, and our plane arrives and the people are getting off. And I said, "There's our plane." And and I go, "Oh my God, he may die before we actually climb those stairs." And so then I see 2 flight attendants, females who are part of our crew, and it's early morning, so they both have 2 very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the front steps to get on the plane. And Mario goes, "When are we going to board the plane?" And I go, "As soon as they sober up the pilots." Yeah, there they go now. I probably shouldn't have said that, but I should tell you that of all the people who've worked at Homeboy in the last 30 years, Mario is the most tattooed individual. I mean, which is saying a lot, trust me. So he's all sleeved out, neck blackened with the name of his gang, head shaved, covered in tattoos, forehead, cheeks, chin. And I'd never been in public with him, so we were walking through the airport, and people are like that with him. People are clutching their kids a little more closely. And I'm thinking, wow, that's interesting, because if you were to go on Monday to Homeboy Industries and ask anybody there, who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works here, they won't say me. They'll say Mario. He works behind the counter now selling baked goods. Kindest, most gentle, tender soul. He's proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing that world. So we get to Gonzaga, and there's the big talk at night, Tuesday night, 2,000 people. But prior to that, they don't tell you that they have 93 other talks planned for you. And this always happens, especially at Jesuit institutions. And so, this class, this meeting, this class, this lunch, this class, all day long, And so I tell Mario and Bobby, I said, "I'm not going to speak at any of these. I'm going to sit in the back of the classroom. I want you to get up and tell your stories." And they were nervous, especially Mario. But they got up and they did a magnificent job. Stories of torture and terror and abuse of every imaginable kind and violence, and honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. So when the nighttime came, I kind of changed in plans. I said, "Look, I know I'm going to do my thing, but I want you to get up before me. Each of you, I want to do a 5-minute, snapshot of your life, so that I can call you up to be at my side to handle questions." And they were nervous, especially Mario, but they did it, and they did a good job. And so I did my talk, and then I called them up, and question, "Yes, ma'am." And a woman stands in this crowd of 2,000. And she says, "Yeah, I have a question. It's for Mario." First question out the gate is for Mario. So Mario, he's a tall drink of water, really skinny kid, and he clutches the microphone, and "Yes," and he's just terrified. And she says, "Well, you say you're a father and that you have a son and a daughter who are about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them?" Mario clutches the microphone, he closes his eyes, and I can feel him trembling standing next to him, and I can feel the emotion sort of rising to the surface, when suddenly he blurts out, As soon as he says those 2 words, he retreats back to his microphone-clutching, closed-eyed retreat. And he trembles all the more, and I can feel him. He's about to burst with emotion. He's getting a hernia trying to finish this sentence. but he wants to get this sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. And she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. 2,000 total perfect strangers stand. They will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had decided to return himself to himself. And in turn, everybody in the audience got returned to themselves, because it's mutual. And everyone in the room could look in the mirror and say, it is the privilege of my lifetime to be who I am. And suddenly everyone saw each other as God sees. And I think that's the only praise God has any interest in. That you may be one, my joy in you, your joy complete. We aren't invited to the grim duty of following Jesus. We are invited to the joy of the gospel, which is the marrow of the gospel, the original program. So now we stand at the margins and we cease to care whether anyone accuses us of wasting our time. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. We choose to be in the world who God is, this exhausted God, and we make those voices heard. Thank you very much.